Thursday, the White House declared a national emergency due to the alleged threat posed by Cuba to the U.S. and the rest of the region. This is yet another attempt to hide U.S. true intentions of unilaterally suffocating the island under the rhetoric of national security. U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order which provides a pretext for intensifying the criminal economic blockade against the Caribbean island. The unilateral measure authorizes Washington to impose additional tariffs on imports from any nation that directly or indirectly supplies oil to Cuba. The order allows the Secretaries of State and Commerce to implement the tariff system and related measures, including issuing rules and guidelines. Let's see some more information on this. The U.S. blockade against Cuba has had a devastating impact on the island's economy during more than 6 decades, undermining the country's development and the well-being of its population. According to figures published by the island's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the blockade has caused material damages and losses to Cuba's economy during the more than 6 decades in force of over $2.3 trillion U.S. dollars. Only between March of 2024 and February of 2025, the impact was over $7.5 billion. The export losses, on the other hand, was of $2.6 billion and that of geographical relocation of trade of $1.2 billion. On the other hand, the blockade cost the island an average of more than $629 million per month, over 20 million per day, and more than 860,000 per hour. According to experts, the island's GDP in 2024 would have increased 9.2% if it wasn't blockaded. Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez condemned this new escalation by the United States against his country. Through his official account on the social network X, Rodriguez stated, "We condemn in the strongest terms the new escalation by the U.S. against Cuba. Now it proposes to impose a total blockade on fuel supplies to our country. To justify this, it relies on a long list of lies that seek to portray Cuba as a threat that it is not. Every day, new evidence emerges that the U.S. government is the only threat to peace, security, and stability in the region and the only malign influence in our Americas. It tries to subject the nations and peoples of our Americas to its dictates, strip them of their resources, mutilate their sovereignty, and deprive them of their independence. The U.S. also resorts to blackmail and coercion to try to get other countries to join its universally condemned policy of blockade against Cuba, threatening those that refuse with the imposition of arbitrary and abusive tariffs in violation of all free trade rules. We denounce this brutal act of aggression against Cuba and its people, who have been subjected to the longest and cruelest economic blockade ever imposed against an entire nation for more than 65 years, and who are now promised to be subjected to extreme living conditions." Also, for his part, Cuba's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Carlos de Cosio, also condemned the new criminal escalation, expressing the following on his X social media account: "In the face of decades of relentless economic warfare, the United States is strengthening its siege against Cuba, attempting to force sovereign states to join the blockade. Under threats of tariff coercion, they must decide whether to deprive themselves of the right to export their own fuel to Cuba." And also in this context, the Chinese government reaffirmed its support for Cuba, expressing its strong rejection to foreign actions that threaten the Caribbean island.
Supports Cuba in safeguarding its national sovereignty and security and opposing external interference. We also resolutely oppose any action that deprives the Cuban people of their right of survival and development, as well as inhuman acts.
In this context, the president of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel, denounced the measure taken by U.S. President Donald Trump to intensify the blockade against the island. Through his social media accounts, Díaz-Canel stated, "Under a false pretext and without any arguments sold by those who engage in politics and enrich themselves at the expense of our people's suffering, President Trump is attempting to suffocate the Cuban economy by imposing tariffs on countries that sovereignly trade oil with Cuba." He goes on to ask, didn't the Secretary of State and Kirklins say that the blockade didn't exist? Where are those who bore us with their false stories that it is simply an embargo on bilateral trade? The president concluded this new measure demonstrates the fascist, criminal, and genocidal nature of a clique that has hijacked the interest of the U.S. people for purely personal gain. More on this. In the scenario of the intensified blockade, Cuban intellectual and president of the Casa de las Americas, Abel Prieto, denounced the unilateral measure announced by the U.S. president. Through his social accounts, he emphasized that the counter-revolution is euphoric about Trump's executive order. They believe or want to believe that this marks the beginning of the end for the Cuban revolution. Once again, they are underestimating our people, our party, and our government. In this edition, the Cuban intellectual also stated that we are also convinced that many decent people around the world, including in the U.S. itself, will support the small and brave David in his resistance against the lying and cowardly Goliath, who is sick with pride and greed through all means at their disposal. We will win, he finished. More reactions on this. The Young Communist League of Cuba also condemned the recent U.S. actions as another measure to economically suffocate the Caribbean nation. Through an official statement, the organization stated that the decree declaring a national emergency due to the alleged threat that Cuba poses to his country and the rest of the region is completely unfounded and a blatant lie. Moreover, the Cuban youth denounced the action flagrantly violates the norms, purposes, and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, assuring that Cuba is not a threat to the United States or any other country and has the right to develop its economic and trade relations without conditions of any kind. In its closing remarks, the organization stressed that among young Cubans, there will never be a hint of defeated or surrender, and vowed to defend our homeland whatever the cost. Meanwhile, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Human Mobility of Ecuador, Guillaume Long, also condemned the measure. In his X account, Long stressed Cuba is not an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. This total suffocation of the Cuban people through the imposition of a blockade on the sale of fuel is not only cruel and imperial, but also, according to international law, an act of war. Blockades are only legal in cases of self-defense. They are always illegal when they seek to collectively punish the civilian population. In such cases, they may constitute a war crime and even a crime against humanity. All states must unequivocally reject this new crime of aggression and act to counter its effects. For her part, Spanish Member of Parliament Irene Montero also took to her socials to denounce the U.S. is besieging Cuba with a total oil embargo, adding to the criminal blockade of food, medicine, and all kinds of products that have been in place for 65 years. This is pure state terrorism aimed at taking over Cuba as well. What are we waiting for to stop them if they are already destroying everything? And one of the topics of the day, U.S. social organizations called for a national shutdown to begin this Friday to demonstrate the rejection of the Trump administration's anti-immigrant policies and to denounce the deployment of ICE and Border Patrol agents in Minneapolis and other cities. Following deadly shootings and raids carried out by ICE, organizers are urging citizens to stop working, attending school, and spending money to protest the agency crackdown surging across the country. In this scenario, they are also calling on Congress to cut funding to the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees ICE, when it votes on the current funding package ahead of a possible federal government shutdown. On Friday, student groups at the University of Minnesota will lead a walkout on campus, joined by unions and immigrant rights organizations. They are also planning additional ICE out of everywhere protests on Saturday at ICE detention centers and offices, as well as at airports to target airlines that transport ICE detainees. Precisely as we were saying, we go live at this moment to the United States. These are live images from Minneapolis in Minnesota. We were saying this in the context of the call to a national shutdown in order to protest the actions of the federal agents of the ICE agency against the migrant shutdown and also against the repression that is being held against the people of the United States. Images that we have been seeing, also 2 people that were killed recently just in the last 2 weeks in Minnesota, and the protests have not stopped. People continue to go on the streets because they are defending the right to peace in their own territories. In this case, it's Minnesota, but the entire country is in solidarity with Minneapolis at this moment. Again, we are seeing live images from Minneapolis where citizens and representatives, including Ilhan Omar, are protesting outside the Bishop Henry Whipple Federal Building, the first stop for immigrants detained in the recent enforcement surge and the site where dozens of bystanders and observers have been held after arrest. We will continue to follow this closely throughout the day, this national shutdown against ICE agents and their operations within the Trump administration, this in the United States today, Friday. United States, another partial shutdown of the U.S. government is imminent this day following the decision by Democratic senators to oppose the budget packages that includes funding for the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS. This decision adds pressure on President Donald Trump, who already faces opposition to his immigration policies, and another government shutdown could further complicate the economy. The final straw was the controversy surrounding the killing last Saturday of U.S. citizen Alex Pretty by federal immigration agents in Minneapolis. Chuck Schumer, the Senate's Democratic minority leader, confirmed that his caucus will not provide the 60 votes needed to pass the 6 appropriations bill unless the section on the DHS is removed. In this context, citizens and representatives in Minnesota, including Ilhan Omar, are protesting outside the Bishop Henry Whipple Federal Building, the first stop for immigrants detained in the recent enforcement surge, and the site where dozens of bystanders and observers have been held after arrest. Let's not forget that these protests were sparked by the death of a second U.S. citizen in less than a month during immigration raids in Minneapolis. During the first year of Donald Trump's second term as president of the United States, the number of migrants who died in the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement have tripled. According to ICE reports, medical complications such as heart failure, stroke, seizures, and even suicide are some of the reasons the agency has attributed to these deaths of people under their supervision. According to the figures, in Trump's first year, from January to December of 2025, at least 32 migrants died due to poor conditions while in custody of ICE agents. Also in the scenario, the American Civil Liberties Union warned that ICE current oversight and accountability mechanisms regarding death in custody are inadequate and insufficient to prevent future deaths. The organization has identified problems with the agency related to medical services for detained migrants, such as incomplete treatment and medication, lack of timely emergency care, and insufficient certified medical staff. The union also asserted that at least 95% of the deaths that occurred under ICE care could have been prevented if adequate medical care had been provided. Thursday, the White House declared a national emergency due to the alleged threat posed by Cuba to the U.S. and the rest of the region. This is yet another attempt to hide U.S. true intentions of unilaterally suffocating the island under the rhetoric of national security. U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order which provides a pretext for intensifying the criminal economic blockade against the Caribbean island. The unilateral measure authorizes Washington to impose additional tariffs on imports from any nation that directly or indirectly supplies oil to Cuba. The order allows the Secretaries of State and Commerce to implement the tariff system and related measures, including issuing rules and guidelines. Let's see some more information on this. The U.S. blockade against Cuba has had a devastating impact on the island's economy during more than 6 decades, undermining the country's development and the well-being of its population. According to figures published by the island's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the blockade has caused material damages and losses to Cuba's economy during the more than 6 decades in force of over $2.3 trillion. Only between March of 2024